And also, quite a number adhere to gender inegalitarian attitudes. So, given this context, when the Population Council had an opportunity to test a series of interventions to prevent violence against women and girls in the state of Bihar, which in the last National Family Health Survey recorded the highest prevalence of violence against women and girls, with 56% reporting of married girls reporting an experience of violence perpetrated by their husbands, we felt that it's very important that we intervene with boys early and to promote gender equitable norms and practices among them. As my colleague Sharmishta mentioned, this was a cluster randomized control trial. And in this presentation, I'm going to shed some light on how the extent to which the acceptability and receptivity to the gender transformative program differed between younger and older boys. So when we recruited these participants, they are aged 13 to 21. They are members of youth clubs. From Shubha, we heard an intervention which focused on school settings. This is an intervention which focused on young boys who are members of youth clubs supported by the Ministry of Youth Affairs. And this is an important platform available for intervening with boys. And I will also be talking about the relative effect of intervening in early compared to the late adolescence based on such indicators as boys' attitudes and notions of masculinity, the intervention to stop incidents of violence they witnessed, and the perpetration of violence against girls. So this intervention used a combination of a gender transformative life skills education program and sports coaching. Very quickly, we had 15 intervention clubs and 15 control clubs. And the activities included, we started with capacity building for peer mentors. And these peer mentors were selected from the NYKS club. The council made a very thoughtful decision about that. We want to test these interventions using government structures because we feel that if proven successful, the potential for scaling up is much easier when you use the public structures rather than trying a boutique NGO intervention. But that comes with its own challenges, so we need to, we have to spend a lot of time building the capacity of mentors from each club. These peer mentors went through about 4 rounds of training, 2 to 3 days each, in building the understanding of violence against women issues, how to conduct sessions, how to conduct cricket sessions. All the participants were exposed to a gender transformative life skills curriculum, which was like a 1-hour session, a total 42 sessions, and it was delivered by peer mentors. And this implementation was facilitated by our partner NGO C3. And they supported, the field animators supported these peer mentors. And as I already mentioned, the boys were also given an opportunity to learn and practice cricket coaching. In fact, when we asked the boys what they would like to, it was their preference that they want to practice cricket. And so there was a 1-hour session. And the cricket was not just simply to engage them. It was, of course, an icebreaker, but at the same time, it was used as a platform to convey fair plays and team spirit and how to avoid violence in a relationship. And the boys were also encouraged to organize community events because we know that there's no point creating islands of change and then they go back to the families and communities where the norms are just against what they learn in these programs. So the boys organized these kind of community events. I already mentioned that it was a cluster randomized control trial. We had 30 youth clubs. And for the evaluation, we used a panel survey with all the club members from both the arms prior to the implementation of the intervention. And at its conclusion, Sharmishta used the data from the control arm for her presentation. We also had a longitudinal in-depth interviews with selected boys who reported at the baseline gendered, somewhat gendered, and egalitarian attitudes. And we followed them up for midline and endline. And analysis was, to intention to treat analysis. We also compared the effect size among younger and older boys using 2-sample t-test. And outcomes of interest, our primary outcome were, attitude related. It was an one-year program. We were very clear that in a one-year program, we are not going to make a lot of change in their behaviors. So we made very clear that the primary outcome will be measured using attitude questions, like their attitudes about gender role issues and notions of masculinity, their perceptions about peer reactions to boys acting in gender equitable ways, and their perceptions about men's right to control the behavior of their sisters, girlfriend and wife, and violence against women. However, we just couldn't resist not to look at some of the secondary outcomes, hopping against the hop. There will be a lot of change, kind of. So we included a couple of other indicators, like boys' intervention to stop incidents of violence against girls they witnessed and perpetration of violence against girls in the 6 months prior to the interview.
Sante, we've got 2 minutes left.
Sure. So how did the attendance and perceptions about the quality differ between younger and older boys? By and large, you don't see a difference. There was a reservations like, you're mixing 13 to 21-year-olds, even within that age gap, it's a long age gap. But we did not see much difference. But when we look at the perceptions about the quality of the interventions, again, both younger and older boys said they equally look forward to attending the sessions. But the older boys said the duration of the intervention was just right. Did the project succeed in transforming attitudes and practices equally among younger and older boys? I have an intervention which did not make everything successful. Like, sometimes we hear a very 100% successful intervention. This was not. But what is interesting is that most of the smileys are the positive change, and the grumpy face is no change. And you will see that there are more smileys when we looked at the subgroup of younger boys. So here is where I say it's important to start early. Otherwise, it's too late. Let me just finish by reflecting, based on this experience of challenges in working with boys. Implementation through existing platforms that are expected to but do not prioritize gender issues and violence prevention is very challenging. And overcoming the lack of leadership skills of those delivering the intervention is very important. It is very easy to say use the existing platforms, but it requires a lot of preparatory times. And sustaining regular participations. I sometimes hear monitoring data showing that 100% attendance. I just don't believe it. Sorry. And reaching communities at large is very important. And, RCTs are the gold standard. But a question we all need to ask is that, maintaining the fidelity of the intervention in a community-based RCT. I don't know. And deciding the ideal length of the intervention. And let me leave you the boys' view. Let us make talking about traffic, road traffic and all, it is very normal. Let us talk sex and sexuality and violence as normally as this boy has suggested us.
Thank you very much, Sante.
Thank you.
It's a very insightful presentation, and your honesty was very appreciated. Mr. Bank. Couple of quick questions, and then we'll get you to respond. Yes, the microphone's coming to you.
Thank you. I've been watching some presentations on some of these programs that are working with boys, especially younger boys, on gender roles and attitudes. And what's occurred to me, and what I'm wondering whether you guys are thinking about it all, is how a school-based program on gender norms will work if unequitable gender norms are being modeled and taught at home. So boys at home are potentially being privileged or taught to do things that their sisters can't do, and there's inequities in those ways and in the parental relationship. So I'm just wondering if your program sort of addressed that at all, or if you have ideas about that.
Can you repeat, sorry, the last part?
Oh, whether your program has addressed that issue, or whether you're thinking about it, or have measured it, or just what your thoughts are on that.
Maybe we'll stay with just that question because we've run out of time, otherwise
Okay.
we'll respond to that one. Thank you, Sante.
Okay. If I heard you correctly, if you're talking about the norms, sorry, I didn't get
the
it.
distinction between what's being intervened with at the school setting when the boys at home are actually hearing the opposite, where they've been privileged.
Well, we have, because when we did the review of literature, most of the programs in India were school-based, and we felt that, there are a lot of boys who are outside the school system, So that was one reason why we use this as a community platform. But I must admit that even in this community platform, there are a lot of them who are school going.
Yeah, I think the concern is that what they might be hearing at home might be the exact opposite of what you're trying to encourage them to think about.
Well, we have analyzed a bit about the peer norms and also community norms as perceived by the boys.
Right.
And we did not see a change. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Santa.
you.
It's a fabulous presentation and very insightful study. Okay.
Okay, we're now down to our penultimate paper. So I'm going to ask Nandita, our second representative from the International Center for Research on Women at the New Delhi office, to come forward.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and have a session focused around safety and violence concerns. So I'm going to talk briefly from a research study that was done in 5 Asian countries, which was looking at the issue of school-related gender-based violence. And the particular data set that I'm going to talk about is around using participatory research and mapping to try and get to the sense of what do children perceive as unsafe about their school. So, like I said, this is part of data that was collected, part of a program called Promoting Equality and Safety in Schools, the PEACE program, focusing specifically on school-related gender-based violence. It was a research study that was taken in collaboration with Plan International, and they had 5 country offices who were very keen to start off programs to address SRGBV. And one of the kind of drivers for that actually was the GEMS program that Shubha had spoken about, and the evaluation of that. It was the entire study was a mixed method design study. There was a survey with about 9,000 girls and boys in these 5 countries. And then there was qualitative data collection, which one aspect I'm going to focus on in this presentation. And the age group was 12 to 17 years. So these are the study countries. There's Pakistan, Nepal, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia. And the particular findings that I'm going to talk about is actually focus group discussions, actually group discussions that were done using participatory methods, which was essentially mapping and unfinished stories with girls and boys in separate groups which were studying in grades 7 to 9 in these government schools. Okay, so I'd like to actually focus a little bit on the method of data collection with children, and I think there's not been so much focus and talk about that. And, way back in 2008, when actually we were starting to design the, working with, children who are 12 to 14 years old, there was not a lot of work that had been done. And one of the primary things was to try and see, and actually maybe reverse the situation that's shown in this cartoon, that there are assumptions that adults are making about what children know, what they think, what they feel. And very few actually go and talk to children to find out, what is it that is bothering them, what is their reality. And while there have been a lot of formative research done with children to try and design and feed into these programs, this particular data set that I'm going to talk about, like I said, is actually looking at the school as a particular space. And the second aspect that it looks at is actually not talking upfront about, do you face violence, not labeling any of those experiences, but essentially just exploring the concept of when you're in school, where are spaces you don't like, where you feel unsafe. The second reason why, we chose to go with this more expanded concept of unsafe was that often there is, because of the kind of experiences that children will face, there is a sense and a perception of fear and safety that can be more limiting than the actual experience itself. And that, the pervasiveness of that fear or that feeling which is not very good can actually impact children more than actual experiences sometimes. The third very important, I think, learning which I still feel that, you know, even though we've made a lot of leaps into doing data collection with children, but still stays is that a lot of children don't trust adults in their surroundings. And they are hesitant to talk to them. In the context of India and South Asia specifically, I think children are not groomed to question and talk openly to adults. And another thing which I think a lot of these programs, and there was talk about, you know, families and parental intervention, is an aspect that really needs looking into, because, you know, the breakdown or the two different ways in which, you know, children are expected to talk to parents and parents expect children to talk to them. That communication is really like a, 180-degree kind of facing one way and facing the other. So this methodology, we thought, is basically going to help to break some of these, barriers that children may feel when you are going to speak to them also about their own experiences. So it's something that, because it's a group discussion, it focuses on their feelings and perceptions, but not necessarily whether they have experiences themselves. So just the process of how this was done. So here you can see across the countries, you know, children making maps. But I just want to quickly go through what were the steps. So the group would sit around, and then we would just map as a kind of a typical school in their community. Then we would introduce a character. So for the boys it was a boy, for the girls it was a girl. And this character was given a name, and we created a little, you know, personality of this boy or this girl, what they like, what they don't like. You know, they go to school, you know, some nice fun things about the character. And then focusing more on the fact that there are some things that this character does not like, or some places in their own school that this character may not like, does not feel like going to. That was the introduction of the aspect of unsafe. And through the story then of this boy or this girl, and as they would transverse, you know, kind of the different spaces in school, the question around, okay, so where is this boy or this girl not feeling good or not feeling safe? What's the reason for that? Like, why are they having this feeling? And what do they do about it? So, you know, how do they feel? Do they go and tell someone about it? And that was really the way to get at a lot of the information around what spaces are unsafe, what is contributing to the safety, and what do children do about it. And finally, the discussion would end with, you know, what do we think needs to be done to change the situation.
Nandita,
So,
you have 2 minutes.
Yeah. So, okay. So here, I'm going to just show one map that we've reproduced in Indonesia, which shows which places are unsafe and what makes the place unsafe. And this is the map. I'm just going to show one map. There's similar maps in all 5 countries to draw attention to 2 things. So the red, so these are the spaces which are unsafe, okay? And I think there is really no space in school which is being left untouched by children as they're talking about where this girl or this boy is not going to feel safe, yeah? From corridors to classrooms, playgrounds, toilets, canteens, every place is mapped in most of the schools around these 5 countries. The second thing is what is contributing to this feeling of being unsafe, and more often than not, it's actually forms of violence, forms of harassment by both teachers as well as peers. And this is also interesting because we have boys and girls, so the ones in red are boys, the ones in in green are the ones girls have said, and there are some common forms that are in purple, right? So I think this was very important because a lot of the times there is this discussion that, you know, we can talk about violence, are we making a big deal about it? It's just normal, actually children are not getting affected. But obviously there is something about the perception of fear that is happening in schools. The second thing that I just taking from that is that classrooms emerge and toilets emerge as 2 big spaces where a lot of things are happening which are unsafe. And through the discussions, these are some of the things that they said what was being talked about, which contributed to this feeling of being unsafe, particularly to focus on one thing. I mean, often in violence, physical violence is taken seriously, and I'm just putting that in quotes, and emotional and verbal violence is seen as, that's okay, that just happens by the way. But the use of humiliating language emerges as the topmost reason that children say they feel unsafe. It came out in the maps, and even in the survey where close to half children said they felt unsafe, this was the #1 reason. So I think there's really a focus on what is being said, how it's being said, and the impact that leaves on children, I think, is a big point that I wanted to make. The other, of course, fights, poor states of toilets, dirty pictures, and lack of responsiveness by teachers is very important.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah. So what do children do? Not surprising, I actually started with this, I don't want to take much time on this, is the fact that there are a lot of consequences. We've talked a lot about mental health, I think this just reconfirms that. But just the last thing to focus on this quote is that children are not really reaching out telling anyone because they are getting pushed back. And you have a range of what happens to them, including them saying that probably the child will commit suicide if this carries on for very long. Last, my point, 2 points actually. One is we focused on the fact that a lot of programs reach out to individual children in schools or other institutions, but very few are trying to talk about just the institution itself. And if we are wanting to have a lot of children go to schools as a way to keep them there and also have aspirations on, I think the quality of that school or the environment is something that we really need to start focusing on through our programmatic interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting paper, actually, kind of thinking outside the box. I think we only have time for one burning question, if there are any. No.
If there aren't, I was just wondering whether I could pop in, unless you have one.
Certainly.
Yeah,
No, go
okay.
right ahead.
I was wondering where social media plays a role. You did mention that there's emotional ways of violence that we are often not taking as seriously. In the context that you're talking about, what role does social media play in terms of hidden or undercover violence?
Yeah. So, social media exposure actually varied a lot across these 5 countries. In the Southeast Asian countries, texting, and sending pictures, etc., did emerge as important. But it was, in the other countries, the actual forms around the spaces was something that came up much more. But it's because the places where they were like rural areas.
Right. Yeah.
Access was much less to social media.
Right.
Ma'am, was any kind of consent taken?
Yes. Yeah, we have a very rigorous, we take consent both from our international board as well as from local
No, but
IRB
from the
boards.
children, I was
Yes,
asking.
yes, absolutely. There's assent and consent process for
Both,
children
for the
because they are
confidentiality.
below 18, yes.
Okay,
For
thank you.
both.
Okay, thank you, Nandita. We're going to close this paper and move to the final paper.
And the final paper is going to be presented by, thank you, Nancy. The final paper is by Nana Appanam Dagadu. I've got the pronunciation correctly, Nana. And Nana is actually going to be talking to us. She's from the Institute of Reproductive Health at Georgetown University, but I believe she's talking about a study in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yes.
Over to you, Nana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Because of where we are in the project cycle today, I will highlight programmatic aspects, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards any of our work with FHI 360 constructing measures around these norms as well. Creating positive socially sanctioned gender norms to support family planning use and prevent intimate partner violence is a growing interest in global health research and practice. Norms are fluid and complex, and they are about expectations. So what an individual believes others are doing, what they think others expect of them, and also what they expect are the consequences of not following the norms. So the Passages Project, which is led by IRH and in partnership with FHI 360, Johns Hopkins Global Early Adolescence Study, Population Services International, Save the Children, and Tier Fund, seeks to change the underlying supportive environment to facilitate more sustainable and long-term social and behavioral change. The big picture goal is to improve unmet needs related to family planning as well as safety among youth, especially those at 3 key points in the life course, so puberty, marriage, and parenting. One specific study under the Passages Project is the Transforming Masculinities Intervention, which is implemented in Kinshasa in peri-urban and urban settings. We aim to shift male gender norms related to family planning as well as intimate partner violence among newly married couples and first-time parents, aged 18 to 35. So working to address various reference groups, and these are the people who are setting as well as enforcing the expectations or the norms. The intervention consists of an 8-week group education and dialogue program with the couples, as well as community mobilization in the broader congregations, public testimonies, and health talks. The intervention was actually developed by Tier Fund, but in this iteration we integrated a family planning module, and that actually also includes working with youth-friendly services to provide family planning and gender-based violence services. We have community health workers who come in to talk with the couples and provide referral information, and then also engaging with clinics and pharmacies operated by PSI. We work with an existing structure known as the Church of Christ of Congo, or in French, ECC, really as part of our strategy for sustainability and scale up. There are 8 experimental congregations who receive the full package and 9 control congregations who receive only the enabling service environment. So we believe that the intervention activities, which you see on the far left of this theory of change, will generate widespread diffusion of ideas among the couples and then to the congregation members. This in turn then would lead to intermediate outcomes that include gender equitable attitudes, norms, and self-efficacy, which help married and parenting adolescents to develop and strengthen relationship quality as well as their social assets and capital. Ultimately, they would resort to nonviolent ways to resolve conflict so that there's reduction in their experience or perpetration of violence. Although for the purposes of today, I'm focusing on intimate partner violence, I wanted to highlight that Transforming Masculinities also addresses family planning, use, and intimate partner violence as a part of the pathway to family planning. And that we definitely recognize that there are many positive effects to these items, as you will see in the ultimate outcome to the right, in terms of sexual reproductive health well-being. So we're using a mixed methods cluster randomized control trial to explore the effectiveness of this faith-based intervention to promote positive masculinities, to reduce IPV, and improve family planning use. Today, I will focus on the part in red, which are the results from our baseline cohort study with 900 individuals who are married and first-time parents. So to start with, here I'm just showing 2 sample attitudes that we included in the surveys. In the first, you see that there's more support in terms of for disciplining a wife. There are several reasons that we looked at, but overall supporting attitudes around disciplining the wife. And secondly, you see lower support in terms of the appropriateness, so a bit of a contradiction with those 2. Here, the literature on behavior change and social norms suggests that outcome expectations, such as the first row, and self-efficacy on the bottom are important variables influencing behavior. So we've included them, a few other ones, I'm only showing 2 here, in the survey. In the Kinshasa sample, there seem to be promising areas to act positively in the face of violence. Right. So I mentioned reference groups earlier. For the particular norms that we're looking at, there are significant differences in the reference groups for women and for men. Here on this slide, I'm only showing the top 4 for each of the sexes. So we see that women are most influenced by their husbands, perhaps because of power dynamics. We see that mothers and mothers-in-law are important for both. And that at over 1/3 for both sexes, faith leaders play an important role, and especially more so for the men. So this suggests some nuances for programming and how we think about violence prevention work. So moving on to the norms, we found that there's a bit of, so we found that the normative element, the most significant one is more around those who, the reference groups playing an important role in how we look, or how the couples look at complying with the expectations of their communities. And then the final piece in terms of behavior, we found that 22% of the women and about 30% of the men had experienced or perpetrated violence within the last 12 months. We looked specifically at certain demographic components and found that if religion was not considered important to the respondent, the odds of perpetrating violence went up. For men, they were 3 times higher.
Nana, I just got 2 minutes more.
So again, we see the importance of the faith community, leaders specifically here. Other demographic factors that we found for women, experience of violence in childhood had a 2 times higher rate for the women of experiencing violence. Other factors were not significant. For the men, we found that men who were first-time parents compared to newly married individuals were 2 times more likely to perpetrate violence. Same with being from a food insecure household. They were 3 times more likely to perpetrate violence. And then just one more example, men whose partners were using family planning were twice as likely to perpetrate violence, which I think one of the other, Anita, I believe, mentioned in her presentation. So just to wrap up, wanted to acknowledge that since there's quite significant influence of the faith community, as well as the differences in the processes and the reference groups for the men and women, just 3 sort of main points. First, that catalyzing change through dialogue and community diffusion activities help to bring some of the assumptions to the surface, so people can share more openly and sort of work out ways to prevent violence in the community and the congregations. Secondly, that there really is an opportunity that we must seize for targeting intervention implementation by sex and also the key life stage transition. So looking at newly married couples and first-time parents as distinct subsamples of the older adolescent population. And then finally, just using process monitoring and qualitative research to understand the change pathways as part of our learnings around what is happening with norms around violence. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Nana. That was a fascinating presentation. The floor is open for questions. Any questions from the floor? Oh, okay. Well, people might be thinking, Abigail, do you have anything you want to ask?
I was just interested. I see where there's a definite bias towards faith and faith-based, but do you think that bias would affect how the women would answer the questions based on where you were taking it, if the faith leaders are also accepting of violence, if that is part of what forms this cultural attitude within the women as well? Because I found it interesting that the women, there was no significant difference between acceptance of the violence.
So we actually found that in terms of attitudes and norms, they think that the faith leaders would be opposed to using violence for both men and women, and that the the way that they're looking at, they don't think that those in their communities or their congregations are using violence themselves, or that the faith leaders encourage that. But then it contradicts a bit with their personal attitudes and what they think is going on in their own communities. So that's where there wasn't a difference with the men.
Okay, if there's no other questions, just want to bring to a close and probably use the chair's privilege for the two of us to share just a couple of comments and our reflections. I think, first of all, just want to say it's been an incredible presentation of a series of papers on a very tough issue. So gender-based violence, thinking about the kind of starting points of early adolescence and onwards as points of intervention. So my main take-home message here is actually commending the speakers and the teams that you're working with and the centers that you're working with to handle this really hard topic, not to balk from it, and you're really doing some really important research sensitively, and I think with a lot of regard for the ethics of it. And it's probably going to be a long road, but I want to congratulate you all and the teams involved for taking it on, because I think this is 8 countries represented in the research, and the way you've talked about collecting information, evaluating that, and shifting social norms is a journey to watch, and thank you all for that. Abigail?
Yeah, I would underscore your comments, Shanti. I think you guys did excellent presentations. I think it's good that although it's obvious that the cultural attitudes are there and they're strong, that you have started good work in terms of the intervention. And I look forward to seeing the follow-up studies in a few years, and hopefully there are the resources given the fact that you have such good results so far. So congratulations to all of you, and thank you for being such a good audience.
And it's lunchtime now, you've earned it.
We have an announcement. Please collect your networking dinner coupon from the registration counter before 4 p.m. Thank you.
They're to sign their papers, right? This disclosure thing.
Oh, that's right.
I don't see it though, so the guy must have it.
So the person who's going to propose the motion is Professor Russell Viner, and then opposing the motion, Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore. It would be interesting to have it the other way around, actually. But anyway, and then we'll have comments from the floor. And I just want to emphasize, these are we're not looking for any questions. If you start asking the speakers a question, I will very politely tell you to shut up. What we're interested in is your opinions. This is all about opinions. So please, comments, and I'll emphasize another aspect of that in a second, which is no more than 1 minute. Yeah? Otherwise, again, I'm afraid it'll be very politely, very obsequiously telling you, shut up and sit down. Okay? And then we have the summing up by the proposer, and we have the summing up by the opposer, and then we do the vote again. Okay? So just to emphasize, no questions, please, only comments, your opinions, that's what we're interested in, not more than 1 minute. And what I'm going to suggest is that when we get to that stage, there will be people at the front here, please, with the roving mics. You've got to run to the front to get to the front of the queue if you want to make a comment, because we're bound to run out of time. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to, first of all, introduce Professor Russell Viner. If you'd like to both come up, we can have you here, who's at University College London, and he's a professor of adolescent health there. Russell has been working for more years than I'm sure he'd admit in adolescent health, both clinically and in adolescent public health, with a special clinical interest in diabetes. Russell is an import to the UK from Australia, and I trust that he'll be cheering on the England team to a glorious series victory to win the Ashes, which will start next month. And since we're in India, I trust I don't need to mention that the Ashes involves young men playing with a ball in public. Okay, the second speaker and the opposer of the motion will be Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, who is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the same institution. We thought it would be quite fun to see whether they talk to each other over the next 4 years or not after the debate. Her list of prizes is far too long for me to bore you listing them or to embarrass her with. But I want to just mention one thing which to me epitomizes Sarah Jane. Alongside her personal research, innovations and advances that she and her team have made, it speaks volumes to me that very high on her wiki entry, she lists the fact that she co-leads the Wellcome Trust PhD program in neuroscience, because one of the things that Sarah Jane has really done better than almost anybody that I know is to promote the field and to bring on the next generation, which at this kind of conference is the kind of person that we want. So we have two fantastic speakers coming up, and I'd like to turn over the floor to Russell to propose the motion.
Thank you, David. I think my slides will come up. I hope they will. They are coming. Aha, they are coming. Excellent. Look, so I think I'm the underdog in this debate. A quick poll beforehand had Sarah Jane on 99 and me on 1 in terms of the debate. You forgot to vote.
Come on, guys. Sorry. Yeah. Useless. God knows how the program's keeping together with this idiot. So let's go for it. So vote. You've seen the motion. Brain imaging has made a negligible, that means almost nothing, contribution to adolescent care and health promotion. So those in favor, put your one hand up, please. And hold it up, don't let it go down. Okay. Those against, hand up. Okay, you're supposed to be looking around, because I'm not going to count. Okay. Over to you, Russ.
So I think I'm the David against Sarah's Goliath, because we do have one of the Goliaths of neuroscience with us here. This is neuropolemics. Neuroscience has been everywhere at this meeting. Almost all of the speakers yesterday mentioned neuroscience, the discovery of new ideas about the adolescent brain, as part of defending their positions, whether it was on mental health, whether it was on young people's rights. It's everywhere. It's become a polemic. But we really need to be very careful about this. If we think of the idea of the developmental mismatch, which has come in many senses from neuroimaging, we could argue, that development of the prefrontal cortex and the dopaminergic striatal systems in adolescence is in a mismatch with development of self-regulation and self-control, leaving young people at risk of risk behaviors and of making perhaps not very useful decisions in hot cognitive situations. These ideas are used by the right and the left in politics in entirely different ways. The right will argue that adolescents therefore have an immature brain and young people must be controlled, and will use this as an argument for abstinence-only sex education, for abstinence-only problems. So we have neuroscience being used to argue for the control of young people. But those on the left will use exactly the same findings to argue that young people can't help their behavior, that we must therefore use harm reduction type approaches. We must work with young people. We must take positive youth development type approaches and help them develop. And so we see neuroscience as polemic. We see the same arguments used for entirely opposing approaches to adolescent health. There's a zero-sum game, potentially, in the end. We also have the issue of neuroimperialism and neuroimaging. inequality. There are over 67 countries represented here, I believe, Susan. If we looked at neuroimaging findings on the adolescent brain, we would struggle. Too closer? Too close. We would struggle to get much past 10, perhaps, in terms of a significant volume of neuroimaging findings. Can we, in any sense of honesty, suggest that the findings that largely come from wealthy, white teenagers' brains should be used to inform policy or practice here in India, potentially in countries around such as Pakistan, Nepal, or elsewhere? It's potentially ludicrous to suggest that in many senses. We know that the environment affects brain development. We know that for children's brain, stress, poor nutrition has a much greater effect on the brain than many other things. And it's very likely that similar issues are occurring in young people's brains. So to take what we know from the high-income world and actually apply it to low-income world is, in many senses, I would argue, unhelpful. Neuroredundancy, well, maybe I made this one up. One of the problems, I think, with imaging is that it tells us nothing new. I talked before about this prevalent idea of young people and, developmental mismatch ideas, and the idea that young people make different decisions in peer situations, make different decisions in hot cognitive situations to those they would make otherwise. But we knew that before we ever invented brain imaging. Our insurance companies have known this for many years, and this is why they cost up driving insurance for teenagers at a very different way, much higher. We often use graduated driver's licensing as an example of neuroscience informing policy, but that's not true. Graduated driving licenses laws have been suggested for many years before the development of functional MRI and before our more recent understanding of changes in the adolescent brain. So this is something we knew already. We've heard during this conference about issues about sleep in adolescence, about stress reactivity, about identity development, a whole lot of areas that we've heard about in terms of, backed up by findings from brain development. But all of those things we knew already. They didn't come from brain imaging. Brain imaging just helped us understand things we knew already. Much is made of neuroscience findings around the social brain in adolescence and the importance, therefore, of peer work in young people. But we've known for decades that peer-led interventions are effective in adolescence, and we can see them from the 1960s. So you know what I'm going to say. We knew it already. It doesn't add. And Vikram, yesterday, in his lecture on mental health, pointed out that Walt Disney knew about adolescence long before we did. And who am I to argue with Vikram? Now look, I'm an epidemiologist, amongst other things I do, and causality is incredibly important. And I think one of the issues about neuroscience informing policy is mistaken causality. We do interventions or make policy interventions based on a behavior. Neuroscience, our understanding of the brain, helps us understand those behaviors. But there isn't some backdoor causal pathway from the understanding to new policy interventions, because it's the behavior that we intervene on. So actually to suggest that neuroscience informs our interventions misunderstands what we're intervening on. And while I'm on it, of course, part of the neuropolemic, this image mostly comes from much of the early work done on adolescent neuroscience, and of course many of those images were pastiches that really aren't true in many senses. They were there to communicate. So, what have we seen? Neuropolemics, neuro-inequality, and neuroimperialism, neuroredundancy. Brain imaging helps us understand and explain our world. It validates us But if we went back 100 years, religion would be the thing that helped us understand our world and validated the interventions we did. Neuroscience and brain imaging just validate our world, make us feel important, but actually have made no tangible difference to what we do as adolescent health practitioners or policymakers. And I might leave you with a quote from another Goliath of neuroscience, Ron Dahl, who wrote in the Journal of Adolescent Health earlier this year, the great journal of our field, with a very high impact factor. Neuroscience has provided, up till now, very little direct translational benefit. Thank you.
Great. So now over to Sarah Jane to show why Russell is talking a load of crap.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be arguing that brain imaging has in fact made an immense contribution to adolescent care and health promotion. First, and only briefly, because it hardly needs to be said, brain imaging has transformed clinical understanding and diagnostics. And the main part of my argument will be the second one, which is that brain imaging has revolutionized our understanding of adolescent development, contrary to what Russell just told you. So brain imaging has transformed our clinical understanding and diagnosis. It gives us the ability to scan the brain to detect tumors, traumatic brain injury, neurovascular disorders, seizures, neoplasms, to make all sorts of clinical diagnoses and to guide neurosurgery. No one could possibly argue that brain imaging has made no difference to adolescent medicine. However, the second point, and the more important point I think in the context of this debate, is that brain imaging has transformed our understanding of brain development, and it's provided us with an understanding of adolescent behavior and development and neuroplasticity. So until about 20 years ago, it was assumed that the vast majority of brain development takes place during the first few years of life. Scientists just didn't have the technology to look inside the living human brain. In the past 2 decades, neuroscientists have started to examine the living human brain at all ages using MRI. MRI scanning, like this, can be used to track developmental changes in the brain's structure. We can measure grey matter volume and white matter volume, for example, by taking high-resolution photographs of the living human brain in 3 dimensions. Functional MRI, or fMRI, is used to track how the brain functions across the lifespan by taking films of brain activity when participants lie inside the scanner and carry out some kind of cognitive or emotional task. Many groups around the world now work in this area, and we now have a rich and detailed picture of how the living human brain develops. This picture has radically changed the way we think about human brain development by revealing that development doesn't stop in childhood, which is exactly what I was taught during my undergraduate degree, that it stops in childhood. But we now know that's not true. Brain development continues throughout adolescence and well into adulthood. And we only know that because of brain imaging. Many brain regions develop during adolescence. Most of the brain regions that undergo very prolonged development are situated in the cortex, the surface of the brain. One of the regions that undergoes the most substantial and protracted development is the prefrontal cortex. This is the region right at the front of the brain, as you know, that's involved in all sorts of high-level cognitive tasks such as decision-making and planning, inhibition of inappropriate or risky behaviors, social interaction, and self-awareness. Many other regions of the cortex also undergo substantial development during adolescence. 2 main age-related changes in human brain structure have been described using brain imaging, particularly MRI imaging. The first is a steady increase in white matter volume. White matter volume increases about 1% annually during the period of adolescence, and that's now been confirmed in many different cohorts, admittedly all in middle to high-income countries. Second, MRI studies have shown that grey matter volume undergoes non-linear changes during adolescence. Cortical grey matter, which contains cell bodies and connections between cells, synapses, increases during childhood. It peaks at some point in late childhood and then undergoes very substantial decline during adolescence. Cortical grey matter volume declines at the rate of about 1.5% annually during adolescence. The increase in white matter observed in developmental MRI scans has been interpreted as axons becoming increasingly myelinated during adolescence and childhood and even into early adulthood, and also axons growing in diameter. And the interesting thing about these two neurodevelopmental processes is that both myelination and axonal growth result in speeding up signal processing in the brain, and that is happening during adolescence across the brain. The change in grey matter development, the change in grey matter across development is proposed to reflect, at least in part, a key neurodevelopmental process, that is the reorganization of synapses. So we know that during childhood, synaptogenesis, the genesis of new synapses, results in a huge increase in the number of synapses in the brain. In fact, the number of synapses proliferates so much that a vastly excessive number of connections are produced. And which synapses remain and which synapses are eliminated depends, at least in part, on environmental experience. Synapses that are not used in a particular environment are eliminated in a process called synaptic pruning, whereas synapses that are used in a particular environment remain and are strengthened. This is a crucial point because it means that the brain may be particularly plastic, and development partly depends on the environment that an adolescent is growing up in. Russell mentioned this. He mentioned the increased plasticity in the brain during adolescence. Well, we know all about that mostly through brain imaging. What does this mean for adolescent health? The changes in the brain might underlie some of the adolescent typical behaviors that were previously put down to hormonal and social changes. Russell's already mentioned these, things like risk-taking, peer influence, and impulsivity. Why does a 13-year-old try a cigarette when they know the health risks? Why does a 15-year-old take sex risks? Why does a 14-year-old with diabetes suddenly stop monitoring their insulin levels? This is the period of life in which we explore our environment, we experiment, and we take risks. It's when we're most influenced by our peers. If you think about the kinds of risks that adolescents typically take, smoking, drinking, dangerous driving, for example, these are not risks when they're taken when they're on their own, it's when they're with their friends. And we now understand these substantial changes in behavior during adolescence as partly a consequence of natural, inevitable, and adaptive changes happening in the brain of all adolescents. So what? Understanding that the brain is changing gives us insights and better ways to deal with adolescent typical behavior as parents and teachers and also clinicians. It also, I'm going to move this slide on, it also allows us to understand that brain development and plasticity confers vulnerability, not just in terms of risk-taking, but also in terms of mental health. 75% of mental illnesses start during adolescence. Why is this? Brain imaging studies can help us understand. Recent studies using machine learning with brain imaging data point to risk factors in terms of brain changes that predict development of later mental health problems such as schizophrenia and addiction. And the interesting thing is, this is where the field is heading, understanding individual differences in brain development and predicting developmental trajectories at an individual level. A handful of recent promising studies have shown that brain imaging data is a better predictor of later mental health problems than psychometric measures. Brain imaging has shown that the adolescent brain has high levels of plasticity. It has a greater capacity for change than an adult brain. This has implications for the legal treatment of teenagers, and indeed, the US Supreme Court has made amendments to the legal and punitive treatment of teenagers based largely on findings from brain imaging studies. It is no longer possible to sentence minors to death in the US. This is a critically important change that was made relatively recently in the law in the US, made largely on the basis of recent brain imaging findings. Brain plasticity during adolescence is also relevant to rehabilitation. The plasticity that makes the adolescent brain particularly susceptible to environmental stressors and confers vulnerability to mental illness also makes this period a period of opportunity for intervention and rehabilitation. We know that teaching adolescents about their plastic brains improves learning. There's a huge field of research on that. To conclude, brain imaging, in my opinion, has made an immeasurable contribution to adolescent care and health promotion. Clinically, it's transformed clinical understanding and diagnosis, of course. Scientifically, it's demonstrated that adolescence is a period of opportunity and vulnerability. Vulnerability to risk, to mental illness, and opportunity to rehabilitation, clinical interventions, and treatment. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The roving mics, have we got the roving mics? If so, can they come to the front, please, the people with the microphones, as quickly as you can. To the front, please, here. Great, because we have a few minutes now for any comments from the floor to make your point. So please run to the front. Where are these people with the mics, please? Where are the people with the mics? Microphones? Okay, great. So if you run to the front and make a queue, don't sit down again if you want to make a comment, because we'll run out of time. Great, yes, please, go for it.
Hi there, I'm Anna Suleiman. Rondal couldn't be here, but I'm here as his co-author to say I think he would feel like you had misappropriated his words a little bit. I'm just saying. But one,
Direct quote.
I know it was a direct quote, but it was a direct quote in a certain context. So one, the adolescent brain is perfectly adapted for the functions of adolescence. And I think Sarah Jane highlighted that most eloquently. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it really is a team science network that's needed. We need the practitioners talking to the neuroimagers and bringing these really fundamental questions that we can test in the lab back to the scientist just as much as we're putting data out. And the other thing that I want to say is there are places, actually communications neuroscience and the work of Emily Falk has been really profound in saying there are moments where actually neuroscience is better at predicting behavior than what we tell, like what we say we like. Communications messages we think are going to be effective can be better predicted by neuroimaging than by self-report. So I think there's a lot of ways that we've had predictions, and Ron is going to, he's going to hear about this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, not sure which side you're on in this debate, but anyway, thank you very much. Yes, over there, please. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm Ménard from Switzerland. I had a question because I thought...
No, only comments, only opinions.
Comments?
Comments and opinions.
Okay, sorry. So what about, because we heard about research being done in northern countries and many health issues in southern countries. So a comment is, I would like to know more about this difference in this field.
Great, excellent. Okay. And over here? Thank you.
Seth Ammerman. Paradoxically, I actually agree with both of you. And here's why. I do agree with Sarah Jane that a lot of the recent brain neuroimaging and studies have increased our understanding of adolescent brain development. I'm very involved with substance use issues with kids, and we know that if you use drugs regularly while your brain's developing in your teens, it could alter normal brain development significantly and cause problems. However, I agree with Russell in that virtually all of what we're seeing has really, with the exception you said of what the Supreme Court in the United States did, but really the vast majority of all of this, as Russell said, is not affecting policy or changing, and when people are using the same arguments on the same science to argue opposite ends of the spectrum, that to me shows we have a long ways to go with this.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, John and then Bruce, and then we will have to close.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, John Santelli, New York. So, I want to reiterate what Russell said, that brain science has been vastly misused in the political sphere to suggest adolescents can't think, their brains are uncooked. or whatever. It clearly has been used in the abstinence-only debate, but as you said, it's also been used by progressives. But the terms of the debate are in some ways unfair, because the issue is really the important clinical issue. Has neuroscience, writ broadly, contributed to clinical practice, to research? And the resounding answer there is absolutely yes. What we know about cognitive functioning, ability to make decisions, clearly a lot of it, as Russell pointed out, came before we had the neural images. But that's been essential. The work on hot and cold cognition has been essential to the work that we all do in the audience. So anyway, in some ways it was a trick question you two were given.
Oh no, did he spot something? Okay, over to you, Bruce.
So I just wanted to say that, there's part of me that completely agrees with Russell, that I think much of the science has just confirmed common sense, or what we knew anyway. But as an advocate for adolescent health, I have no doubt at all that neuroimaging has supported us enormously. It engages people in a way that we can't often engage them with our normal language. And somehow, being able to show a slide of a brain makes it real for people.
Great. And finally, Madam?
So I work in the juvenile justice system in the United States, and I'll say two observations. One is, at one of these institutions that I was clinically involved in, one of the counselors to the juvenile delinquents said, "Oh, we learned that their brains don't work, and that's why they do all this stupid stuff they do, and they can't even, they're not smart, and so we should treat them sort of as imbeciles, basically." And so he was governing his activity towards these young people every day based on this information that he got from neuroimaging. On the other hand, the neuroimaging and the Supreme Court decision for the death penalty was influenced by it. Also, though, that's confounded by the vast amounts of evidence that have been done by the justice system itself on crime, the age of crime, the peak of crime, the social elements of crime. And there's been more research done in the past 10 to 15 years on juvenile delinquency itself and its social factors than anything else. So
Great, thank you very much. So now we turn over to Russell to say why what Sarah Jane was saying should not have convinced you.
Yes, let's get rid of those slides. Okay, my supporters, do not be swayed by the honeyed words of Sarah Jane. Brain imaging gives us understanding, but it does not contribute beyond that. And I think that's what Sarah Jane showed you. Number one. Number two, the Supreme Court of the United States, well, let's be honest, the Supreme Court of every other Western country had made the same conclusion way before on the basis of simple human rights. So again, we knew it already. Simple human rights have been around for a long time. So, without making too fine a point, can I get each of you to reflect about your own practice? Whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a clinician, practitioner, whether you're a researcher, and think, truly, have brain imaging findings changed what I do? Unless you're a brain imaging researcher, of course, you don't count. Have findings from brain imaging changed what I do in policy or practice in the last 6 months? Have I treated a young person differently in a very substantial way? Not just in a way that helped me understand what they might be going through, but has it changed what I did? And I think you will probably find the answer is no. Thank you.
Has what we now know about the brain made us treat adolescents differently? That's a question that I sometimes ask teachers I work with, many teachers in the UK, parents and clinicians who work in adolescent health, and the answer is almost inevitably yes. It makes a huge difference to know that the brain is changing in such a substantial and protracted way during the period of adolescence, when just 20 years ago the assumption was that the brain does not change after early childhood. In fact, what brain imaging has shown is that the brain undergoes vast development during adolescence. This makes adolescence a period of opportunity for learning in schools and for rehabilitation and treatment in medicine. The capacity for change in adolescence is greater than in adulthood, and we know that largely from brain imaging studies.
So it only remains for me to thank both speakers and to see the vote. So the motion is that brain imaging has made a negligible, i.e. almost no impact on adolescent care and health promotion. Those in favor? Okay. And those against? Okay. You can all see what you see. So, over to the next session. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
Ask them to put their hands up if they change their mind.
Okay, yeah, in either direction. Who changed your mind? Did anybody change their mind? Gosh, that obviously shows that we're not adolescents, doesn't it? Yeah, fixed opinions. You can hear all the arguments. You still will hold to what you came in the door with. Let's get better at that. Who changed their mind? Ah, it's better, slightly better. One more hand went up. Okay, thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ross, and thank you so much to our speakers for conducting this session so well. I must say it was quite interactive and engaging. But there's no one point that fits to both of it. We just can't give one point that's right or the other wrong. So I must say that brain imaging, it's definitely helped us in transforming clinical understanding and diagnostics. I think many of you here would agree with that. So ladies and gentlemen, now we request all of you to please join us for the sessions that will be happening in co-meeting 3, 2, and 1. You can go through the itinerary and you can choose whichever sessions you feel interested in. Thank you so much, and tomorrow we'll meet here at the same time, 9 a.m., and we'll begin with our day 3. Thank you.
Be good if people want to come closer. It doesn't seem like we'll have a full room. So it would be nice if we can be a little more intimate with each other. Thanks. right, good evening. Welcome to our evening session on intersectionality of adolescent well-being, why gender norms matter. We have a great panel here, and thank you for being with us. We would like to keep it engaging, but the way we'll set the panel up is we have our 4 guests. We'll ask each of them questions, and we'll give them some time to respond to them, and there might be another round of questions from me as the chair, and then we'll open it up for a discussion with all of you. So I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Priya Nanda, and I'm with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, working out of the India country office. I work on measurement, learning, and evaluation. And prior to this, I was at the International Center for Research on Women, working for over a decade on adolescent health programming. So that's my interest. And I am really pleased to be introducing this panel, and particularly the Align platform, which is the Advancing Learning and Innovation on Gender Norms, Align, a new initiative funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, managed by the Overseas Development Institute. And Project Align basically aims to connect a global community of researchers and thought leaders to convene and equip them to challenge and change gender norms through developing and sharing innovations and convening to advance our understanding and knowledge on how gender norms can change and how that contributes to sustainable gender justice. Align this week has just launched a digital platform which contains curated knowledge and key resources on gender norms, theory, policy, research methodologies, interventions, and innovations. So that's about Align, and Align, as its launching initiative, has chosen to focus on this topic today for our discussion on why gender norms matter when we're really talking about adolescent psychosocial well-being. I think we've been hearing about mental health and psychosocial well-being at the conference over the last 2-3 days, how it's really critical for adolescent development trajectories, and at different points of age, there are different kinds of markers of psychosocial development, which can either be leading to well-being or ill-being or mental health, depending on what life circumstances are and what kind of lack of capacities and opportunities adolescents have in their lives. But while we are kind of working on adolescent psychosocial well-being, we have very little awareness of how gender norms in society at a much broader level affects these development trajectories and transitions that adolescents face. So I think the focus of this panel is to really try and understand the intersectionalities between adolescent transitions and broader gender norms, and how we can bring a greater understanding, awareness of this in our research, in our practice, in our programs. We have a really interesting panel here. They're going to reflect on these questions from their own vantage point, and really think through in their own work, in their own practice, in their own research, how have they considered gender norms, and what have they learned, and what are the evidence gaps. So that's really the broad mandate of the panel today. And I'd like to introduce them one by one, and then we'll begin the panel. So on my right, we have Professor George Patton, who most of you would know. He's already been on the plenary in the last 2 days. Professor Patton is a medically qualified epidemiologist with a clinical background in child and adolescent psychiatry. He's from Australia, and he's a National Health and Medical Research Council Senior Principal Research Fellow. But he's also currently the chair of the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing, which many of you heard about in yesterday's session. Next to him is Dr. Fiona Samuels. She's a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, UK's leading think tank on international development and humanitarian policy. Fiona is an anthropologist and social development and health specialist who manages multi-country research projects in Africa and Asia on themes that span gender-based violence, mental health, and psychosocial well-being, including HIV and migration. And she has taken a lot of work on gender norms, and today is going to talk about her research in multi-country settings in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. On my left, we'll start from the outside, is Dr. Gracie Andrew, who is a clinical psychologist and experienced qualitative researcher. She works now with Corestone, an organization which develops and provides personal resilience programs to improve well-being for youth, focusing on adolescent girls as critical change agents in their community. And Gracie was, prior to joining Corestone, she served as the executive director of Sangat Society, an NGO based in Goa that has been a leader in the field of child and adolescent family health in India. She's trained at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Sexual Reproductive Health. And next to Gracie is Jordan Tewati Smith. He's from New Zealand. He's a medical student with a passion for indigenous health, especially Maori health. He has a strong interest and belief in the effects of research on the health of communities and has completed projects in the field of Maori health, children's health, and gang health, and the health of young men. Each of these terms has a Maori name, but I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce it. I will do it at the end of the session after hearing you. Jordan has recently been appointed to the Lancet Youth Network. He's one of the 6 youth working with the Lancet Standing Commission to progress recommendations from the 2016 Lancet report, including engaging and partnering with young people as agents for change. So it's a really nice, broad panel. We're going to have hopefully an exciting discussion. I'm going to start by addressing a couple of questions to each panelist, give them about 7 minutes to go through this round of questions. I'll do a second round, and then we're going to open it up to you all, and we'll try and do this in a manner which really brings some interaction with the audience as well. So I'm going to start with George. So George, as a member of the Lancet Commission, how do you see the emerging role of gender norms in addressing adolescent psychosocial well-being? And in particular, what are some of the key evidence gaps that you see that about underlying gender norms which contribute to adolescent psychosocial well-being or ill-being? You can decide to take whichever one. And I'm particularly interested if you also focus on issues of masculinity as you respond to this question.
Priya, thank you so much. And it's really good to be here. And congratulations to ODI and actually sort of having us in this discussion. So I'm coming to you as a researcher who's been sort of really interested in child and adolescent development, and really very much interested in this phase of life where sort of you have a transition from childhood through to adolescence. So the pubertal transition really is a point which, where there's a discontinuity in health, growth, development, and a divergence emerges between boys and girls at this phase of life. And so that, for me, has been something which has been really important to understand. So for boys, we sort of see the emergence of completely different kinds of health problems. So they're related to aggression, related to substance use. In girls, we see the emergence of mental health problems. We also see, obviously, the burden of reproductive health problems in girls, which boys don't face to anything like that extent. Many of these differences between boys and girls that begin at this point in life, they continue all the way through life. So for boys, and this is true in almost all places, boys then have a pattern of higher death rates, higher mortality than girls, and that continues right across the life course. For girls, what we actually see is we see higher rates of ill-being. So for girls, as they make this transition, and this is true in many different places, that sense of optimism, that sense of positiveness about themselves and the future diminishes. That's less so for boys. So we have this sort of paradox, higher mortality in boys, higher ill health in girls, and that sort of really is something that begins this phase of life. So that for me is something that we need to understand better. And puberty, for me, is one of those central events in this. Now, we don't think enough about sort of puberty and how that pubertal transition happens. So I often ask an audience, say, when does this begin? When does puberty begin? And people commonly say, well, it begins around 10, 11, 12, something of that kind. It actually begins much earlier. And it begins when kids are typically in mid-primary school, so in many contexts that's around the age of 7, 8, grade 3. And it's the maturation of the sort of adrenal gland, which happens at that time with a rise in adrenal androgens. Now these are sort of this is a really important event because it marks the beginning of a new phase in development. And it's a phase where kids are beginning to discover and create who they are. So they change from being children who are taking passively in. Well, they're not, children aren't entirely passive, but they become more active at this point in shaping their environment, who they are within that environment. The peer group becomes more important because the peer group is where you achieve social standing. The peer group attitudes, values, those are in turn shaped by the broader community norms, including gender norms. So this is the age at which gender norms begin to become entrenched, where they get under the skin. So for me, this is a crucial age for intervention, and I think if we're looking at intervening, whether it's been boys around the machismo, the hegemonic male, that's the hegemonic male, you asked me to say something about males and how males may be shaped, where that is the dominant view, that is the prevailing dominant perception of what a male should be, and that's true in many different places. That's damaging for that young man or that boy, that young man in terms of his health, growth and development. It's damaging for other males who don't actually share that identity. So they may be males with other sexualities. Damaging for women within that community as well, girls and young women in that community. So that is an age at which we need to be intervening. I think we've had a lot of focus on girls and young women for very good reasons. Gender norms profoundly shape life trajectories for young women. I think what we've forgotten, though, is that they also shape profoundly gender norms for young males, and how they shape young males will also influence the opportunities for young women. So those would be the two sort of gaps that I actually see. This early pubertal transition, that late primary, pre-adolescence, if you like, that's a crucial point at which we need to be thinking about how we shape more equitable gender norms and thinking more about boys within the mix.
Another one. Okay. Would you say that we have enough evidence in understanding what's happening around that pre-puberty, pre-adolescence time and gender norms? So could you kind of bring out in your thinking what might be some of the stark evidence gaps from your perspective?
I think tab 2 is better. Look, we have forgotten a lot about the sort of age group 5 through to 14 and almost everything. Whether we're looking at sort of understanding sort of what the health problems are or what the determinants of health are in this age group, we focused a lot on the under 5s. And sometimes it's almost as if we thought that development stops at the age of 5. Development continues well beyond that. It continues right through to the age of 25. The youth have had some focus in research, and so in the global context, they've often been the focus of intervention programs. But this phase tends to be in a phase of life that we feel uncomfortable about. And this is true almost everywhere. It's true in my country, it's true here, it's the phase of emerging sexuality. That's something, emerging identity. And so I think there have been sort of some cultural barriers here in a lot of places to really looking at this age group carefully. So I think we need more work here. And yeah, obviously work at this age is different. You're talking about children who don't have the level of literacy and understanding, the kinds of approaches. We may not be able to use the same research approaches in this age group, we can't, as we do with older adolescents. But I'd like to see a lot more work in that area. So in Australia, we actually have a study of this kind, and we think it's probably the first in the world to actually look at kids in this transition intensively every year as they mature from 7 right through to the age of 17. And I can tell you that the development that is happening in terms of kids shaping their identity, their capabilities, what they take forward into later life, what they take forward into parenthood and the next generation is profound during this time. It's sometimes been called latency, and that was a term that derived from psychology. And latency implies that there's not much happening. Believe me, this is a hugely active phase of growth and development.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come back to a couple of things that you talked about later. But Fiona, I'm going to move to you to kind of building on what George has just talked about as the overall framework as what might be happening in pre-adolescent stage and how differential morbidities or differential health outcomes may emerge for boys and girls. From your perspective, what do you see is the role of gender norms in affecting adolescent well-being, especially these kind of differentials that start emerging through puberty, maybe using the lens of sexuality and violence?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I actually got into mental health and psychosocial well-being, because I'm not a mental health expert. And I think it started maybe 6 or 7 years ago when we were doing research with adolescents, and these were mostly girls, but also boys. And we were using a capabilities framework, so drawing a lot on the work of people like Amartya Sen, Nussbaum, and Kabir, amongst others. And through this framework, we explored different kinds of assets, so economic, social, political, human, that ultimately either enable or hinder individuals to meet their full capacities or potential. Similarly, we explored the range of social institutions at different levels which affect the everyday lives of adolescents and in general play a very big part in affecting how their lives will be lived out. I then became aware that there was this underlying dynamic or dimension that was often not spoken about. And at the time, at least amongst the sort of disciplines I was working in, more in development field, anthropological, sort of less around the sort of psychiatric or clinical or mental health dimension, was relatively little researched and relatively little understood. So what was it? And this we were looking at and framing as kind of emotional and psychosocial well-being. And it seemed that these kinds of feelings or relationships or dynamics were underpinning much of the behaviors and outcomes for adolescents. But they was largely silent at that point, at least from our perspective. So what was this? Where does it originate from? What are the patterns and characteristics? And specifically, how does it play out across different age groups, different genders, and different settings? So we started focusing on this dimension full on and carrying out various studies. At the same time, the notion of norms began gaining greater currency in the development world and also in the public health world. And it's really great to hear this term being mentioned so much during this conference, and particularly in sessions focusing on mental health. And I think there's a real progress and a real step that is being made on this. So what are these norms? So for us, we see them as it is increasingly recognized that norms are part and parcel of everyday lives. They influence and guide attitudes and behaviors, and they are produced and reproduced both formally and informally through a range of mechanisms and institutions, including social interactions. Many of these norms are gendered and discriminatory, often affecting girls and women more than boys and men. So obviously they also are discriminatory towards men and boys in certain contexts, but we were focusing more on girls and women at that point. And the effects of these gender norms are far-reaching and touch on most domains of a person's life, including on their mental health and psychosocial well-being. Another dimension that we keep hearing about in this conference is that adolescence is a particularly pivotal stage in a person's life. And it is a time when girls and boys start undergoing a range of changes as they transition from childhood to adulthood. And I won't go into these because they've been spoken about a lot in this conference, but they include neurological, bodily changes, etc. But critically, what is interest to us and to this panel is that the environment starts having an effect on adolescents at that type of age or that juncture in their life course. And in particular, the norms which are embedded into the communities and which implicitly guide behaviors, attitudes, and social actions start playing a pivotal role in their lives. And they also create the potential for mental ill health and psychosocial distress. So exploring the intersection of gender norms and mental ill health and psychosocial well-being during adolescence is particularly pertinent, though it is not to say that these issues obviously are not important during other stages of the life course. And girls in particular during adolescence begin to confront the constraining roles and influence of gender norms in a range of domains, from education and marriage to mobility and career aspirations outside the home.
I mean, that's a really nice way to kind of frame the interaction of norms and transitions to adolescent psychosocial well-being. But you know, I think one of the things is that we're talking about these really broad societal changes, and it's really important to understand in a more granular way, how do you deconstruct some of these kind of large shifts that we're talking about, and how do they interplay with these transitions and the structures that you talked about, you know, the institutions and the structures that are also influencing transitions to psychosocial well-being. If you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So unpacking, unraveling, deconstructing, this sort of interplay and sort of linkage and pathways between gender norms and mental ill health and psychosocial distress becomes critical. And it's quite interesting because we've done quite a lot of work across different contexts, the context that Priya mentioned, but also in countries like Vietnam as well. And it's very interesting to see that there are actually quite a lot of similarities in the way things are played out, but there are also context-specific specificities as well. And I want to try and deconstruct this or sort of pull out the more concrete things by drawing on specific examples of these gendered norms that we're talking about. I think often these gender norms translate as a decline in freedom for girls. So freedoms that girls once experienced become severely restricted. So for instance, while a younger girl could go out of the home relatively easily in a context such as Nepal, as she reaches adolescence, she is no longer able to, or no longer able to do so on her own. Similarly, contexts such as Pakistan, strict rules that enforce purdah are in place, with the aim being to curtail girls' mobility in the public domains. Now this is largely because at that age, in these settings, the girl is considered marriageable, and if she moves around on her own, her honor is at risk. This also often coincides with her being taken out of school, as again of paramount concern for parents at that point is marrying her to a good family. And as a result of all of this, the girl is likely to feel powerless, disempowered, she's unable to control her own destiny and future, she can lose hope, she can become anxious and fearful, and particularly if she's being married to an older man, which is still very common in these contexts. But post-marriage, mental ill health and psychosocial distress can continue. A young bride is often living far away from her natal home, in an area where she knows no one. As an outsider, she can become isolated with no opportunities for social interaction, and therefore also no one to whom to confide. And one young married woman interviewed in Vietnam poignantly told me that if it were not for her children, she would have taken her life a long time ago. She was depressed at having married young. In her case, it was an elopement or love marriage. She was completely isolated, and it seemed also that her husband was abusing her. But norms also include, and we've heard about this here as well, largely implicit rules on how men should treat women, based often on contrasting and opposing notions of masculinity and femininity. In short, according to our findings from a number of studies, again in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, men should be seen to control women, and particularly their wives, who in contrast are seen as inferior and subservient. In many occasions, this male control can take the form of violence towards their spouse, both physical and psychological. This violence is accepted by many people, including the spouse. and also because of a range of additional or intersecting norms that restrict the spouse from speaking about it. So such norms include a perception that violence between a husband and a wife is a private matter, that is, that it is perceived as a husband showing love for his wife, and that leaving a husband or divorcing him would bring such shame and stigma to both the woman and her family that staying in an abusive relationship is preferable. And all of these behaviors obviously affect the mental health and psychosocial well-being of girls and women. They feel undervalued, face isolation, fear, pain, and also hopelessness, as they are usually unable to see a way out. I just want to conclude by saying that this is not to say that there are no positive role models. There are supportive men, be they brothers, fathers, fathers-in-law. Some adolescents are resilient, and it's been great to hear about some of the work being done on resilience here at the conference. And we have also looked at what we call positive deviant cases or outliers, where girls have been able to somehow, because of a range of intersecting factors, sort of surmount the difficulties that they've been facing. So there is positive, but amongst all that positivity, these sort of patterns continue to persist.
Great, thank you. Gracie, I'm going to turn to you. I think, we've kind of heard the broad conceptual framing around why norms matter and how very specific examples of how Fiona has seen through her research it plays out in adolescent well-being, and the point that George already made, that it continues. It is an effect that continues through marriage, and it's a lifetime of ill health or ill well-being. I'd like you to reflect on your work in India and both talk about why norms matter or which norms matter, and do interventions which tackle psychosocial well-being need to address gender norms, and also if you want to talk about how.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, I'm going to repeat some of the things that Fiona said because it resonates on what I've seen on the ground in Bihar.
Can you all hear?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So we worked in Bihar for several years now, 5 years, and we've been providing resilience programs to thousands of girls and boys in government schools. And this is what you see on the ground, is that the minute a girl reaches puberty, everything changes in her home. So, and we all know that. She stopped, mobility stops, she's not allowed to go out, the parents or the mother will ask her to get more involved in household activities rather than go to school. Sometimes she's forced to get out of school. And she's on one hand facing the changes that are happening in her body, and she cannot talk about it. And then on the other hand are all these restrictions around her. So as she faces this, you find that self-efficacy decreases. And when self-efficacy gets affected, it's a vicious circle because she then cannot advocate for herself or talk about it or kind of negotiate with her parents, giving her the freedom to get out, to go to school, or attend classes, continue education, not get married. So it's kind of a vicious circle. And we found when we did our trial with 4,000 girls, we found that the girls in the control arm that did not receive any interventions, the self-efficacy actually went down or lowered. So so this shows how it's connected, how psychosocial well-being is connected to gender norms. It's part of a girl's life as she kind of reaches puberty. And about interventions, I think it's, of course, since they're connected to each other so closely, any intervention on psychosocial well-being needs to look at gender norms. And in our resilience work, we kind of found that these were in the work that we do, we don't really, when we start working with them and building skills on resilience, we don't talk about gender directly, but we find that the girls bring these issues to the groups. We just teach them the skills of problem solving, but most often the problems that they bring to the group are related to gender norms. So any intervention that needs to, they're connected so closely, psychosocial well-being and gender norms. But I would like to say that I think when you're thinking of shaping your intervention, you need to look at the context. So the context can be different. Say in Bihar, a girl in Bihar village, in a Bihar village, there is a lot more discrimination and inequity where she's asked to get married. Like she has to start getting ready for marriage by the time she just enters puberty. So the norms are very different. Years back, I lived in Goa and I did some work on gender. And there, when we went and did some work with young girls, we found that it was not as bad. Like girls are allowed to go to school, or they're not discriminated as much. But at the same time, she does see her father, alcoholic father, hitting her mother. And she does see discrimination there. So the context kind of varies in different places. And I think when you're thinking of an intervention, you need to kind of look at the context and tailor it accordingly.
It's interesting. I think one of the things that I can also relate to from my work is that the same point is that, how you internalize some of these effects in your life, it continues and it manifests in different ways at different life stages. So the fact is that if you don't, the question is, can we change norms? Norms are really big. Are we changing norms, or are we building resilience and negotiation to address and understand that these norms are getting internalized? And that's the first, perhaps, challenge is to understand that, and that may be the important framing in the programs. I presume that that's the way you build the resilience curriculum, right? Is to kind of start making that connect for individuals, that we have to understand that these are norms and we could potentially challenge them, right?
Yeah, so the way you build resilience, you teach them skills, you teach them to understand that they have strengths.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the work that we do comes from positive psychology. We get into teaching them about character strengths and the strengths that they have. And then you teach, once they understand that they have strengths and they can use it, you actually automatically, self-efficacy improves, self-esteem improves, and then it's easier to kind of get them to look at their lives. Mm-hmm. How do they negotiate with their parents? Mm-hmm. How do they talk to them and convince them about their lives? And the kind of circle I was talking about kind of changes, or the pattern changes, and they're able to.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back to some of these issues in our next round, but I would like to move to Jordan, who is coming from a very different space into this discussion. I presume you don't work on adolescent well-being. You're a medical student. You're probably more exposed to biomedical approaches of learning till now, but you're also somebody who's working with the Lancet Commission, and you are interested in intersectionality and indigenous health. From your perspective, how does this framing of adolescent well-being really, how do you relate to that within this dominant paradigms that you've been exposed to in your medical education? And how do you see the framing of gender norms informing your own work as you build it out within the communities that you want to work in?
So, kia ora everyone, my name's Jordan, as Priya introduced me earlier. I just want to set a context and introduce to you who I am and where I'm from. So I'm from New Zealand. I live in Wellington now. As Priya said, I'm a medical student. But I was born into a Māori family, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And I grew up in a small rural town My father he shore sheep for a living, and my mum dropped out of high school and had me when she was 19, and she worked in a fish and chip shop for a long time. My family is heavily exposed to all the bad statistics around, when you talk about Indigenous health, there's lots and lots of discrepancies between the Indigenous populations of colonised countries and the non-Indigenous populations. So our family really are the living example of that. Many of the males in my family are part of one of the prevalent gangs in New Zealand. My father's a gang member. And so that's kind of the sort of exposure I had when I was little. Now, I was quite lucky because I got the opportunity to go to a school in the South Island, away from where I grew up. And it was quite a high decile school, so I got a lot of opportunity in terms of education, and I moved into a university and obviously achieved well enough to become a medical student. Now, a lot of young people don't really have that opportunity, so I thank my parents for that. So moving on to the questions that Priya asked. On the psychosocial models that most of us should understand, when we talk about the biomedical model, I think I interpret it as a part of the psychosocial holistic model, and psychosocial still doesn't really cut it for me. When people talk about psychosocial models and stuff, I just think that it's much more than psychosocial, and especially in the context of Indigenous or Māori people. We're a very spiritual group of people, and so that's really important to consider when working with those Indigenous populations. I think when we try and relate this to gender norms, obviously I'm not an expert. I'm still on my own learning journey in terms of getting my head around these things. But I was thinking about it today when I was writing my notes, and I think it's really important to consider from a Māori perspective that cultural norms influence these gender norms, and they don't always have to be negative gender norms. And I think in New Zealand there's a much different landscape for gender norms. The issues that these people up here have been talking about today. When I think about going back to the psychosocial model, a few of you might be aware, but what we're taught in medical school is there's a really good model. It's called Te Whare Tapawhā, and it takes kaupapa Māori methodology and creating a holistic model that non-Māori can use. And it considers four walls that build a meeting house, and it considers the physical, so the biomedical side of medicine, the spiritual, as I was talking about before, the connection to our land, our people, our lakes and our rivers. It considers the physical, social, I'm sorry, I just got a complete mind blank. But it basically considers the whole, 4 dimensions of a person, and there's lots and lots more models that obviously consider other things as we progress through the time, such as sexuality and gender and stuff like that, and the forces that they have on the New Zealand landscape. And I just wanted to touch on the importance of female and male roles in the Māori culture. So culturally, females and males have very separate roles. For example, on a marae, on our meeting house, on our, on our land, and that can actually be very empowering to have that purpose on the marae, and it's we're very supportive and of males and females. But I found it quite interesting because the last couple of years I've come to realise the progression that's being made. A lot of people say, you know, we can't be stuck in the past. We can't keep using these Māori principles because they're so old and we're in a new time, and now this is a shared space. It's not just a Māori space. But I think we're very progressive, and an example of that is our takatapui population in New Zealand, and it's been culturally recognised by Māori that there is no longer just two binary options for gender, and I think that's you know, a really big step. Yeah, I could go on for ages. But.
Okay, so this is my next round of questions before we open it up. George, you know, you said a lot of things, I think, which are really important. You talked about the different ways in which these transitions happen, and you talked about ill health for girls and probably higher mortality for boys. You brought that up as a paradox, and you specifically talked about substance abuse for boys and maybe mental health outcomes for girls as psychosocial ill-being. And I thought that was really interesting, that gender norms are not just affecting women and girls' transitions, they're differentially affecting boys and girls. But I think the discontinuity in girls' lives and how it affects their bodies and sexualities probably manifests in deeper ways because it also transfers intergenerationally, right? So I wanted to, like, using that maybe as a larger context of what you said, if you had to say what is the one or two things that we really should be paying attention to in our future research and program looking at this intersectionality, what would that be?
Priya, thank you. And I fully agree. You know, in the sense that this is a critical time of life for girls and young women. Early marriage, early pregnancy, these change the course of life in a way which is very different for young men. Ultimately, sort of the effects on men of gender norms are not so critically timed, but they're probably equally profound. So what are the key interventions? Well, we've had a lot of work focused on young girls and young women, and there are certain things we know. We know that education is really critical in the lives of girls and young women. It's also important for boys. And that's probably important in a whole range of ways. So boys who are better educated actually marry later as well. Fathers who are better educated have their girls who marry later as well. So it's important for girls that boys are educated. To get education, you have to get certain other things right. So girls have to be nourished. So nutrition becomes really important in terms of intersectorality. Contraception, access to sexual and reproductive health services. This is really important as well. Families, social norms need to change. So these are really important things that we need to get right. But there are some micro interventions that we could also be looking at differently as well. And I think schools are a fabulous environment for us to be intervening. We have some great examples of interventions in school, and some that are emerging now, and I probably shouldn't be talking about, but I'm going to talk about them as long as you promise not to take it outside of this room. So schools that promote inclusion, a positive social and emotional environments, they're good for girls, they're good for boys. And this is crucially important in girls staying in education. So bullying, violence, victimization, these are important reasons why girls leave school early and decide that it's actually going to be easier to get married and have a child. So making schools a better place. We have some examples of this. We have some examples from where I work. A number of years ago, we did a project which was the Gatehouse Project, which actually looked at making schools a better place for girls and for boys. It was interesting. What worked for girls was different from what worked for boys. But making schools a better place, that actually improved patterns of health risk. It actually changed patterns of initiation of early sexuality. So the schools where we actually intervened, rates of really early sexual initiation of sex, and this is in 13 and 14-year-olds in the Australian context, were half what they were of the control schools. Now, some of those lessons have actually been taken, and Vikram Patel and this is the one I shouldn't be talking about, but just to say that the Seha trial in Bihar, it's a fabulous trial, really high quality, cluster randomized trial, cohorts of 15,000 kids successively. It was doing the same thing. It was making schools a better place for girls and boys. So it was tackling some of these things such as gender norms within schools and tackling them in a range of ways, tackling them in the classroom, in the peer group, through education, through health, through education. It was tackling violence and bullying and aggression, making schools a better place to be, and gender norms shifted, mental health shifted, particularly for girls. So this is the kind of intervention that we ought to be looking at and sort of looking at, scaling up at a time when secondary education is extending in places all around the planet. You know, this is a setting where we can be intervening around gender norms, and if we do that, it'll be good for girls, it'll be good for boys, and it'll be good for the next generation too.
I'm convinced. No, but seriously, I completely agree with you, and I think it's not very distinct from some of the work that's been happening, but I think the way you're framing it, to me, it's like the focus is on the institution and the mechanisms of institutionalizing the norm, and you know, in contrast to a lot of the life skills interventions which are focused on individuals, and here we're really talking about making schools healthier and a better place, which in a way then shifts a larger norm and belief system around what's good for boys and what's good for girls, and what makes a good girl and what makes a good boy, because that's a norm we actually encounter when we go to the community, and also builds individual efficacy and resilience. So I think it's a great, you know, it's a great place to think about your intervention, you know.
Yeah, look, absolutely, Priya. And you know, to the extent that, you know, we turn a blind eye to something like Eve teasing.
Yeah.
In this context,
yeah.
We're actually endorsing sort of gender norms that are bad for girls, bad for boys. You know, this is the kind of thing that we need to be challenging.
So Fiona, just building on that, I mean, that was kind of very concrete example from George. What do you think, based on some of your learnings in the countries where you've been working, would be like lessons around how gender norms can be incorporated in interventions that are particularly tackling adolescent psychosocial well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I'd firstly like to start by saying I think there is increasing awareness of the need to, you know, think about and focus on mental health related and psychosocial related interventions. And it's, you know, obviously great to see all the post-its and sort of presentations, etc., in the conference here. And then we also have some sort of global movements as well. For instance, in the SDGs, there is a mental health goal, and there are some targets associated with it. However, funding remains a huge issue, as we heard yesterday. There's only 1% of global health funding is going to mental health, which is really problematic. And I think the needs of adolescents are largely unmet, and particularly in developing countries, and where our programs often tend to be age and gender blind. In terms of what can be done in terms of working on psychosocial and gender norms, I think we need to, and this also builds on what was said yesterday, we need to think about conversions and intersectionality, and it's really critical to think about that here. And I think we need to build into programs, for instance, which are focusing on early marriage. We need to link these programs to, you know, what does that mean in terms of psychosocial well-being and mental health, and think about ways of mitigating them. You know, in countries like Vietnam, for instance, there are quite a lot of mental health doctors, but there's a sort of the cadre of sort of social workers or psychiatrists or psychologists is largely missing. And so I think we need to sort of, you know, make sure we integrate, we have this cadre of health workers there available as well, but also importantly, they need to be aware of the sort of the underlying gender norms that are often, you know, the drivers of mental health and psychosocial distress in many of these contexts. We do have a lot of successful interventions which can be replicated and scaled up, and we've heard, you know, some of these also from George just now. I think we also need to think a little bit more broadly. So it's like, you know, what are the programs that are empowering girls? So for instance, girls' clubs, you know, we've done quite a lot of evidence reviews on the role of girls' clubs in empowering girls, and they have a significant impact, which obviously will have an effect on self-confidence, self-esteem, and ultimately in psychosocial well-being. We know that keeping girls in school can also, as long as we have sort of youth-friendly or friendly environments, we can also think about encouraging girls to attend schools through social protection strategies, which we also spoke about earlier on. So I think there's a range of good evidence out there. We heard about hotlines as being one approach, and we also telephone hotlines. We also found these very effective in contexts such as Bangladesh and Vietnam, and they're dealing also with sort of gendered norms issues which are affecting psychosocial well-being.
Great. Well, you talked about a lot of things, but one that really piqued my interest was hotlines, because when I was developing a program for adolescent girls' efficacy and psychosocial well-being in schools in Delhi, what came up was many concrete examples of the violence they face in their everyday lives, including incest, and not having any place to go and talk about it. And the program actually led adolescent girls to talk about these issues to us, but what we realized is we really didn't have any referrals, and we didn't have any spaces to really address some of the anxieties and mental health outcomes that are coming out, getting manifested. And in a way, you're developing a program to build efficacy, but in effect, you might actually be bringing out a lot of the ill health awareness amongst adolescent girls, and we don't have resources. So Gracie, turning to you, I want to know from you, how do we address that complexity? I mean, sitting in India, you know how difficult it is. We don't have counselors in schools. We don't have that many hotlines, and there are all these laws around what we can and cannot do with minors. So what is your sense of where is the next generation of evidence-based programming? Where do we have to go? Especially maybe you can even reflect in the context of the government programs here. So you can choose to, I mean, it's a large question, so choose to respond it the way you wish to.
Yeah, so there is a lot of movement in mental health to train lay counselors. So there's been a lot of work happening, even in the work that George is talking about is actually training lay counselors to work with young people. But what I would like to kind of go back to what you said about individual and, go back to the program, institution, is that like in the work that we do, the kids meet in a group. So you have a lot of, I believe that adolescents themselves have a lot of capacity within themselves to handle a lot of distress if they support each other. So what we find in our work is that it's not individual. You kind of bring them in a group and they come up with their problems in the group, and a lot of issues, even to do with safety issues. Like girls have a problem coming to school because they're getting harassed by boys. And they bring these problems to the group, and the group actually helps them solve the problem. So a lot of things, I feel that adolescents themselves are very creative. They have a lot of potential in them, and they're a huge positive group, and they are able to handle distress if they know what it is and how they can handle it among themselves or support each other to handle it. And then, of course, there are young people or adolescents who face trauma, or who face abuse, or who face something more than what can get solved within that parameter, who need, interventions, specific interventions. And that's where I think, of course, you need adults around them to be aware of how psychosocial ill-being is connected to all these issues so that they support them. That's a second layer. So you have to kind of build an enabling environment among the adults, the teachers, the schools. So you have a whole positive school movement happening. So once you do that, the numbers that really need specific individual interventions will be a small number if you kind of deal with all this. But then, of course, you know, you have counselors that can be trained and handle it. So that's how I look at it. Maybe it's not.
Maybe somebody from the audience will bring up the question of out of school, but I'm going to move to Jordan because of time, and I hope to engage with all of you as well. I mean, we've been talking about adolescent programming, gender norms, specifically for adolescent programming, Jordan, but I'm trying to take this back to the context where you are coming from. And what I heard you talk about was culture. And I wanted you to maybe think about, are there limitations of an approach that focuses on gender norms in the work or practice that you think would be important from where you're coming? Or do you see some overlap between culture and gender norms from where you are sitting? If you can just reflect upon that.
Yeah, I suppose just going back to what I said earlier about considering gender norms from a cultural context, and then the importance of the more than just the psychosocial models when dealing with them within healthcare. And I speak with my medical student perspective now. From what I witness, we are mainly biomedical, so we don't consider these outside things that might be impacting on their health. New Zealand is quite progressive compared to some countries in terms of using these models to assess different aspects of health, but we are still very much in the biomedical, and we're still in an age where the social history is taken after the medical history, which is backwards when you consider Māori principles where building a relationship before you can actually have trust and be able to fully engage with a patient is considered. Another limitation, I think, from the themes that I've been talking about is racism, the big R word. It is very, very prevalent in the New Zealand health system, and it's a system that's just not working for Māori, and will not therefore work for the gender norms, the social norms, and the racial norms that come along with that. Yeah, I think that answers your question in short.
All right, I have a few more questions, but I just wanted to be really have others participate. Maybe you have reflections on the same topic from your practice, your research, or maybe you want to direct a question to somebody in the audience. So I think there are mics, and if somebody can help us take them through. Is there any questions or reflections? Anybody would like to participate? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. This has been really interesting to think about. And one of the questions that I have as we think about adolescence is sort of what is the unique inflection point during adolescence? It's not like gender starts in adolescence. There's definitely an identity component that young people have that transitions. But I'm wondering, how do we think about this as part of the trajectory that young people are going through? What type of changes do we need to be making as far as early childhood, the messages that young people are getting then? And what are the bigger structural issues? Most of the interventions that we're talking about are directly affecting young people themselves, and probably that's not where the solution is going to come from. So what are the other solutions we need to be thinking about?
Look, Anna, that's a great question, and I think it's a really important question because, where are we going to sort of get the best effect from sort of interventions? And these interventions aren't going to be simple interventions. They're going to be sort of multi-level interventions, and they're going to be right across the life course where we have opportunities to bring about change. But to my mind, it is this time of the emerging individual. And it is this time, late childhood, the transition through puberty, that to my mind is where the individual is creating herself or himself and takes it forward into later life and all that comes in later life, including being a parent and passing it on to the next generation. So to my mind, that's a crucial point. Now, I think there are some sort of individual, my belief is that, that's actually probably got a biological underpinning, and Joe Boyden and I have talked about this, because I think what it does is it catalyzes the individual to engage with her or his world in a very different way and take on board culture and social and gender norms at that time. So that, for me, would be the point at which I think the intervention is going to be critical. So I think we start too late, and I think we should be sort of thinking about these interventions during primary school and continuing them through. And I think we need to be thinking about what the interventions are at the individual level, at sort of the micro-social level, so within families, within schools, within communities. But obviously it goes beyond that. And it's got to be sort of at the social norms, but the institutions, Jordan mentioned institutional racism. Well, we have institutionalized gender norms. I can tell you that in my country, right through until about the 1970s, if you were a public servant, if you were a teacher, for example, and you got married as a woman, you had to leave the workforce. That's institutionalization of inequitable gender norms. Now, that's really recent, and we're we'd like to think of ourselves as a country which has fairly equitable norms, but it's very recent that we weren't in. And I think we've got a lot further to go. Gracie mentioned this thing about sort of girls and ill-being, or I talked about it as well, but you talked about it in the sort of the context of low resource settings, low and middle income countries. This is a phenomenon we see in high income countries. And I'm not sure that we understand it really particularly well. Why is it in a high income country, like the United States or Australia, that sense of optimism, sort of about the future, positive sense about oneself, why does it change for girls during this late childhood, early adolescent transition? I don't think we actually properly understand that. I mean, we need to.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question, but Fiona, Jordan, Gracie, whoever wants to take
Okay, I'll just add to what George was saying, and I think actually in the UK at the moment, all the people from the UK know that mental health and girls is really hot on the agenda now. It's been talked about, almost every day there's another news item, about self-harming or body image or, depression, anxiety. So I think it's really hot on the UK agenda. And I think just to build on this sort of, I know we've heard quite a lot about it and we often use it in our sort of operations or interventions research that we do, is, this socio-ecological model. I think you do have to intervene and work at, not intervene, you need to work at all different levels within the family, beyond the community, the norm enforcers who are critical sort of juncture points or gatekeepers. We have to work with them. And yes, the level of the sort of meso level, often that sort of meso level sort of gets neglected, so you might have, good policies at macro level, a national level, but when you actually see what's happening at a sub-district or a district level, in terms of sort of mental health and psychosocial well-being or understanding of gender norms, often gets lost there. There's sort of this interface which is missing. And we do have really good examples of programming around, for instance, working with couples, around discussing norms around violence. And I think, people, even community members have told us, it's no point to come and do one program for 3 hours and one workshop and then you disappear. All these things need time. They need to be wraparound, they need to be holistic, they need to be integrated. Intersectionality is key and then ongoing and over time. Behavior change takes time. I think we all know that.
No, I just kind of agree with George that you have to start working early, but adolescent is that period when it becomes like it's a peak, and you have to. But gender norms or gender concepts start very early, and you have to begin at primary school or with parents and in the community.
Can I just jump in here, because it's so interesting. We do talk about the social ecological model, but we are talking about when we should intervene for a child. When should we intervene for a parent? I mean, the fact is, when we think about intervening for the child is when the parent's anxieties about a pre-puberty child becomes heightened, bodily changes, sexuality. So it's like a broad question because we know that we are changing norms around sexuality, bodily autonomy, but we are trying to develop interventions at the individual level through resilience, through curriculum for children. But there are approaches, positive parenting approaches and all of that. So I think there's also other interventions that we could be thinking of in our construct. Right? And there is no inflection point for that. I mean, we should be talking to, proximate to parenthood adults now about, wouldn't you agree?
I agree. You have to work with parents as you work with the kids.
Yeah.
And its interventions have to look at the structural issues.
Yeah.
It has to be simultaneous. And the most difficult is the cultural factors. If we were successful with all the work that we've done in gender for so many years, if we still see so much of inequity, there's something wrong that we're doing and we're not able to reach that point of change that we need in the cultural view or the way we look at things. We really need to look at how can we change those structurally.
I just had a quick add-on to what Fiona was saying about the importance of programming and intervention. And about this very grey inflection point that everyone seems to talk about, sort of heading into teen years. And then also I resonated with Priya's words about the individual versus the family wider sort of scope. And I actually just remembered those two extra walls that I was talking about. The other one was family, and then the final one was mental. And so I think there's a few good examples in New Zealand of that model, creating interventions that also feed into the individual and the family and the community, because Māori tend to live in those constructs. So, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Surbhi, and I had a question about how there are larger structures and how they interact with this intersectionality of psychosocial well-being as well as gender norms. For instance, in India, closer home, there are larger structures such as that of caste that dictate the way in which girls identify themselves. So for instance, when I was working with young girls in Anganwadis and we would try to involve young adolescent girls, some of them won't even enter the Anganwadi just by virtue of the caste they belong to, the so-called, so to say, quote-unquote, lower caste they identify as. So my question is, the discussion that you were having was about individual interventions versus group interventions. How is it that we can engage with such girls when there are larger structures that seem to be interfering with their identification as not only as girls, but as members of disadvantaged caste, so to say?
Does anybody want to respond to that? Because I think, yeah. I mean, okay, please go ahead.
Look, that's an absolutely fabulous point. And, gender norms are intimately related to culture, intimately related to the structures social structures that underpin culture. And I think that this is in terms of thinking about how we shift things around gender norms. Inevitably, we're going to be changing sort of other sort of aspects of culture as well. So it's a really terrific point that you've made. It's not going to happen quickly. And this is something which some of you will have heard Bob Blum talk about, the Global Early Adolescence Study. One of the most interesting findings from Bob's study, I think, is that it looks as if gender norms have an intergenerational dimension. And that where one acts today with girls and boys, it links into more equitable gender norms in the next generation. Now, I suspect that's an indication of how complex these things are to actually change. And probably in terms of, I'd like to be sort of thinking that we could, find a magic bullet to change gender norms, make them more equitable overnight. I don't think that's actually going to happen. I think we're going to have to take a longer view. And that's a view of the complexity here of and really understanding exactly what you were saying. How do gender norms link more fundamentally into culture, and how does that link back to the way in which an individual comes to have an identity and status within that particular culture? So just a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's very important to note that gender norms are not static. They are changing. They are sort of going backwards and forwards, not necessarily always in a positive direction. And I think what we have tried to do is try and look at which are the ones that are sticky and why are they sticky. You know, and I think it's also quite interesting to see some of the work we've done in Bangladesh, for instance. There are some like norm setters that we term them norm setters, and sort of people or institutions which somehow are having effect on changing norms, also around violence. But I like to think of it a bit as like one step forward and maybe half a step back. I'm not sure if it's a full step back. And I think it's really interesting what you say about the intergenerational dimension, because we actually found something a little bit different. We found that it sort of perpetuates itself a little bit, you know, through some of our case studies. We saw, for instance, a woman who was quite sort of modern in her perspective when she was younger. She migrated, she worked, she had career aspirations. But when she came back to Bangladesh and she became a mother-in-law, and she had a daughter-in-law living inside the house, suddenly everything sort of turned around, and the norms around expected behaviors around young wives started being put in place. So there's sort of cyclical, one step back, one step forward, half a step back, I would like to say.
Yeah, look, and I think the intervention that Bob was talking about was an intervention which was across the whole of society in Belgium, because that was where he found the effect. So I think it is something where we need to be looking sort of more globally and more comprehensively right across the community. And I think the example you gave is just a terrific example of how things can change back for the individual, moving back into a social context where presumably she was wanting to fit in.
I think I want to go to the audience again, but I think it also goes back to my responses. When we conceptualize inequalities and structures, we can't look at gender dislocated from caste or modernity dislocated from patriarchy, as your example is, because modernity and education doesn't mean that we actually addressed hierarchy and social status. A woman gets married, becomes a mother-in-law, that's the way she gets status in her household. So I think there are all kinds of complexities that have to be addressed when we design and conceptualize programs. So I do think that point is very valid. Rakesh, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm from north of India, and I have some unique observations, and I make 2 points for now. One is about, this, we are trying to disturb a long-standing balance of power. So my sense is that there is a special need proactively to approach the boys. Unless, we are kind of, empowering the girls, and that automatically does not lead to disempowerment of boys. The new balance has to be achieved, so boys have to be more ready. And therefore, I agree with George's point. He is been pointing out to boys several times. I think we should have big-scale programs for boys. And it should start from preschool, from the parenting model as well, because many of the gender social norms are set there. I am seeing a particular problem in my own household. I am a daughters-only family. My younger daughter looks like empowered one, and I am looking for a sissy boy to match her with, because I think if I get a boy who is in the current gender situation, there will be a fight for dominance between the two of them. I am worried. So as a parent, I need help. My second point is I come from health sector. So taking from Jordan's observation that in biomedical model, are we preparing our health workers enough? They would be required to handle the consequences of these imbalances or gender changes. But what power the health workers have to identify those at the moment, and how do they help in prevention of this? So if I could get some sense from all you guys.
Okay. So any other thoughts, questions, and then we'll just maybe have a round from the panel, please.
Thank you, thank you. Mine is taking you back a bit because Fiona said we might have a good policy framework. What if that policy framework is not there? Or what if the policy framework is the one causing the strengthening of those negative norms? I was thinking about the example George gave about making schools a good environment in my country, and with the research we have been doing, we found that dropping out of school, it's because of most likely of the bad experience at school. Yeah. But again, we have a presidential order that is stipulates that you can administer a corporal punishment to a child in the household or at school, as long as it is commensurate to the offense they have made. But then it's up to the person punishing to decide how bad that is. And sometimes it's we say it's you are beating the child as if you are killing a snake, and they drop out of school. I didn't see any hints or tips on how to go from those experiences to the policy level, because I'm seeing learning, I'm seeing innovation for moving gender norms, but I'm not seeing how to take this forward to influencing governments and rigid policies.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, reflections, and then what we'll do is we'll just have a round from the panel taking on any of these issues to respond to. Please.
I just wanted to ask a little bit sort of about research that's showing that young people are sort of wanting to push back and challenge a lot of these gender norms, and you see young males you know, talking about equality in their intimate relationships and wanting to share decision-making with their partners, but then experiencing pressure from their family and from their friends to control their girlfriends, and sort of really trying to grapple with that. And then on the other hand, girls, you know, wanting equality as well and empowerment, but that kind of leading to them actually not acknowledging, wanting to acknowledge inequity in their relationships as a young person. And so I'm just wondering if the panel has any ideas about how we can support young people to sort of explore these like complex intersections of their identities with these new and changing gender norms, and how we can kind of incorporate all of that stuff into intervention to support our young people into, you know, going through all of this complex time.
Okay, so is there anybody else? I can't see. Okay, so I think maybe you can decide which issue you want to take on, or maybe respond to all. I'll leave it to the panelists. We'll just go through the round. Yeah?
Look, just to say those are three fabulous questions, and I don't think any of us are going to be able to answer them properly. So Rajesh, your point is absolutely right, and I think that, look, you know, the women's movement has been terrific in terms of empowering girls and young women. We've seen nothing similar in boys. And so there is this puzzle, I think, that boys are facing around the world, young men, which is, you know, how do I sort of achieve social status? How do I sort of become a person who achieves that without needing to have power over women? And I think we're not necessarily helping boys enough, because the focus has been so much on girls. And Yeah, my sense is that in a lot of places, boys are actually the ones who are really struggling. And I think that there is some generational catch-up, but I think boys are possibly a generation or two behind. And certainly, there is a phenomenon of boys getting lost during their 20s as young men. And that's a phenomenon in my country, it's a phenomenon in many countries, and it's complex. I think it's not just about gender norms, it's about the social structures that have provided sort of identity. So jobs, for example, aren't necessarily there for boys, not necessarily there for girls either. So I think there are a whole range of complex changes here, but I don't think we've focused enough. And the question then comes to, well, what can we do? And clearly, I think we need to be looking at the settings in which boys and girls are growing up. So clearly, families, communities, schools. Schools are sort of one that I've thought a little bit about. And schools can be a number of things for girls and boys. They can be just a holding place. And that's actually sort of a criticism. For example, Bangladesh. We're talking about Bangladesh, so girls stay in school as much as boys. Actually, they stay in school for longer, but they're not actually getting a quality experience. They're not learning stuff. And so when they leave school, they're not necessarily getting the full benefit of the education. But I think we're needing to rethink what development looks like during these years, what education looks like. So in many places around the world, it's all about cognitive development. So how well you do sort of academically. And that's true for girls and for boys, and that puts a lot of pressure on kids. Probably something which is really bad for mental health to have that exclusive focus. I think we need to be thinking about social and emotional development much more sort of in the school setting and how we provide. So Anna Suleiman was talking earlier, and sort of Anna and her colleagues at UC Berkeley often talk about, well, what does the social scaffold look like during the adolescent years? And that social scaffold is a social and emotional scaffold, one that is protective and empowering, which allows sort of identity development to actually occur in a nurturing environment. So I think we need to be thinking about these institutions, families, communities, schools, in a way as to providing that kind of input to girls and boys. And I think if we do that, we're going to be providing an opportunity for boys and girls to learn the pathway through the teens into sort of adulthood. And in doing so, I think we'll change gender norms.
Isimbi, your question, definitely, it's very difficult when you're trying to do to do sort of positive programming or interventions when you have actually a bit of a restrictive policy coming from top down. I suppose a simple answer is I suppose, but it's not as simple to do, is to start working not just with adolescents or the young people, but also with the teachers. I mean, I think it's critical to work at that level and sort of to push from above and to push with through peer as well, peer effects. I think hopefully when you have these sorts of approaches and actions, then hopefully it will filter upwards as well. And I think also one approach that was also mentioned yesterday is that through showing the effects of what might happen if this policy doesn't change, the costs of not changing a policy often is a way of going about these things, or the costs of inaction. What does it actually mean? More violence, more mental health, more suicide, whatever. So I think it's sort of the costs of inactions. I mean, your point is really interesting because we found a lot of this. Even though more and more this sort of modern behaviours are being exhibited, even in contexts like Bangladesh, sort of dating relationships are sort of more in the open, in urban Bangladesh, for instance. But in fact, what they're often hiding, sort of patriarchal attitudes continue. So the boyfriends continue to control their girlfriends. And in fact, what is happening is that it's becoming more silent because often they feel unable to talk about it, and often the violence might not be physical. So again, it's more difficult to prove and to talk about. And so I think it's a really challenging issue. And we're also finding a lot of backlash. So, we have some empowered women and girls coming forward, and the men react often by putting even stricter or harsher norms around that. So it is a real challenge, and I think I had a very interesting discussion about the role of religion and the role of religious leaders, and this also responds to your point a bit earlier. And I had one person was telling me, of course we have to work with them, of course we do, we cannot help but work with them. But another very interesting NGO, leading NGO, was saying, we tried to work with them, but it didn't work. We need to go to like the modern platforms now that adolescents and young people are using in the social media and these kinds of networks and approaches, although they can also, put pressure and they can lead to addictive online behaviors, etc., but they actually can be used for the positive as well. So I think we need to look at sort of creative, innovative sort of interventions, building and drawing on different communication strategies, but it's a tough one. I agree.
Briefly, Jordan and then Tracy.
Going back to what I think you guys were saying about the boyfriends controlling their girlfriends, I don't know if I'm answering any of your questions, but I know in my own relationship that we have this sort of co-empowerment, and I kind of chuckled when I heard you say, oh, she needs a sissy boy because she's the empowered one and there's going to be a fight. Well, everyone fights. That's how you learn, and I think the co-empowerment between a male and a female, or non-binary, whatever, is important.
So some of the comments were very valid, and I think it's very, very important to work with health workers and also to work with policymakers. But what I would say is that we need to basically not just educate, say, the stakeholders like teachers, like Fiona said, or health workers about gender norms and its connection to psychosocial well-being, but even how to talk about psychosocial well-being, because they don't even know how to talk about it. So that's very, very important, I think, a point that I wanted to bring up. And with policymakers, I think it's important to bring, educate them about the evidence that is there, what kind of programs work, and really understanding how it works and the importance of bringing gender into these programs, showing them this. That's, I think, very, very crucial. So these are the 2 points I would like.
Okay, so just as the prerogative of a chair, I'd like to just say a few things that were really struck for me. I mean, I think definitely the fact that we have to be thinking about earlier and earlier ages, and we have to understand what is happening to psychosocial well-being, ill health, anxieties at earlier ages. We don't understand enough, and we have to understand that differentially for boys, girls, in interactive spaces with culture and, community. I think what was also to me very important is that gender norms are not dislocated from other kind of inequities and intersectionalities. So, it's not like when we talk about gender norms, we are absent of other structures of inequities such as caste or indigenous groups. I think, to me, it's just an entry point or a lens to understand all kinds of other structural drivers of inequalities in society and how they actually interact very closely with other forms of inequality. So I think sometimes we get obsessed by male-female inequalities as gender norms, but I think it is intersectional and it is interactive, and we have to really broaden our conceptual framework. But I think what's also important, which I think we haven't understood well enough in program evidence, is that do we need to change gender norms to enable psychosocial well-being, or enabling psychosocial well-being will eventually change gender norms? And is that a longer term act than maybe deciding these are the gender norms? We should really think about changing such norms around mobility or, freedom in digital, expressions. So I think that we have to get more specific about what norms we can change programmatically, what norms will change secular over time through enabling empowerment and resilience. So I think we need a little more evidence and research on that. And there isn't. We don't have enough of a sense of what's happening. I hear a lot of all of us convening around understanding norms, and that's good, but I think we need more specificity around that. So with that, I'd like to close the panel. I'd like to thank my panelists. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting conversation even for me. And I hope all of you enjoyed, and thank you for staying till the end.
I hope I didn't confuse you. Well, I'm glad.
I think the sound